and didn't come from a real political family, although my dad had been, as I was sharing with Gordon, had been a president of a labor union in Fond du Lac. Says, how did I run as a Republican then? But when I went to graduate school, the Oshkosh, Fond du Lac tend to be smaller cities. Think they're big in Wisconsin. And when you're a high school athlete, everybody in town knows you. The city newspaper editor in Fond du Lac knew I was going out to Washington, D.C. and said, here's somebody who should get into politics. And I was looking forward to working at Brookings Institute and getting the research, but he contacted Congressman Bill Steiger, who from Oshkosh, in his office, and they offered me a job. So I worked part-time while going to graduate school. And so that really started the peak of interest of TV. This is furthermore, when you graduate from Johns Hopkins, a lot of people go into the State Department, and I remember sharing with them, you know, if you're in the State Department, you got to wait for somebody to die before you move up. And it's only by political connections you can become an ambassador. Watch, we'll be able to move a lot faster in the political arena. So it was kind of a conscious decision in that respect as well.
Well, we'll stick with you. So the Wisconsin budget's a massive undertaking. So I think it makes sense to do some basic education for everybody. You know, how does the process even start and how does it progress?
Well, first of all, a lot of us, and things keep changing in politics. So even things we say, the other thing I think as we went through, it's almost like the old story of the blind people trying to identify an elephant, what it is. So each of us may bring a little bit different perspective from it. My perspective will come from having been on finance committee as well, which is the key legislative committee that puts things together. When you're asking how it starts in many different fashions because everybody knows it's coming up, but it's legally started and formally started with the introduction of the governor's budget to the legislature, the process you see publicly. A lot goes into putting the budget together prior to that.
You just sit down and start it, right?
The budget has to be submitted to the legislature by the governor, which in itself is a very lengthy, very intense process. And I noticed in your notes you had the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which the legislature relies upon for information, but we also have the DOA, which is what the governor relies on, the budget shop. So it's very intense going through every agency, every department's budget.
Well, that's a good segue. Ellen, do you want to talk a little bit about the DOA, what they do?
Yeah. So, and, you know, I would say the budget actually starts in July of the year prior to when the governor introduces it, because what happens is the governor, through the Department of Administration, sends a request out to every agency, and the budget request, the agency budget instructions go out to agencies in that summer. And the agencies are given their guardrails of, you know, don't increase more than 2% or whatever it might be. They give the guardrails and say and then the governor basically tells the agencies, send me your budget by September 15th. And so all the agencies then work in that meantime to prepare a budget for the next 2-year cycle. And they send that into the governor's office. The governor's office then goes through it. Here's some other stakeholders during that time. And then submits it works with its own budget shop. There is a staff of a dozen budget analysts in the Department of Administration. Each of them are assigned different various agencies and expertise. They help the governor refine that budget and the agencies. And then the governor then submits it to the legislature from there. So the DOA often will work with the agencies to define and refine their budget processes. A bill that was passed a few years ago also requires every agency to basically submit 2 budgets. They have to submit one with whatever the governor asked them to do, but then a 5% cut to the existing base too. So they have to show, Yeah, that was always hard, because I also saw this from the viewpoint of an agency head when I was chair of and DOA, we had our own budget. But as head of the PSC, we had to put forth the budget that we wanted. But then we also had to put forth a budget showing a 5% cut to operations from the base year as well. So that was a newer statutory thing passed recently. So yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It is, and
Yeah.
I mean, I'll let you lead with the questions, but it does raise some issues of what this does to agencies in their spending pattern.
Yes.
Because you can imagine if you are frugal and have money you can carry over as an agency, you're looked upon as not needing as much money
Correct.
next time around.
So-
So they're saying this is just how you build these things
Yeah.
and the reaction you get by creating some action.
Wasn't uncommon at the towards the end of that fiscal year for all agencies to start to buy like extra office supplies or a chair or a desk or something because they had to spend down those funds because they didn't want it left over to say, well, I needed that allocation, because you want that allocation the next year. Not unheard of. I'm sure maybe it happens here.
It would never happen here, but I
Never.
will say, if you go to our offices, you'll find about as many like little towelettes to clean your glasses.
Yes.
That I'll need until the end of eternity.
Yes.
And that certainly was something that was a last minute purchase
Yes.
with our little department budget, but go ahead, Gordon.
Yes.
I think we're touching on a lot of the things that tells you how complicated the administrative and the political are. Because we have a 2-year budget in Wisconsin, it isn't really just the 6-month budget process that you're paying attention to. If you're someone who's really following the budget, someone who's in the legislature, we get 3 revenue updates over the 2-year period. In fact, in January, there'll be another revenue update that tells us, okay, here's the economic forecast that we have over the next 2 years, how much money we think is coming in, how much money is expected to go out, and what kind of position that puts us in. The DOA will have a similar projection. Department of Revenue will have, here's what our revenue collections are. So all of those things will kind of shape, here's how much money we'll have. But getting back to the agencies, I mean, the agencies they are part of the executive branch and of the governor. And if the governor gives instruction that I want a 0% budget, then those things are going to come out. And we started seeing more of that because it used to be agencies would always, when I worked for the city of Long Beach, agencies would request more than they were ever going to get because the answer was always no unless you tried, right? There was, you get penalized for being frugal and you get rewarded almost for requesting more. Well, what we would see at the state level is agencies would request 5, 7, 8% increases. And then the newspapers would come out and say, oh, they've got this structural deficit of billions of dollars because they would need to, come up with X amount of revenue to cover an 8% increase, which was never going to happen anyway. So that's when we started seeing more instruction on 0%, negative 5%, those sorts of things. So when you say like, well, how does the budget process really start? I mean, for the bureaucracy, it starts the day after the last budget passes.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones who need to start formulating, okay, this is what passed this time. This is what's going to happen over the next 2 years, and how are we going to plug some of these holes where maybe federal money's not there anymore, and those types of issues. So, from I know we've got a group of people that are of the public in here. I would say the budget process from how does it really start when it's time to pay attention is the governor introduces the budget. And the next 6 months are spent in debating that budget. But in the buildup, everything that we've talked about, the buildup to that budget involves all of these considerations that kind of create the context for how that budget will be debated.
But it's also the time where the behind the scenes, like the lobbyists, where, sometimes that gets a negative, but that's where the people that represent maybe your trade group, whether you're a realtor or a builder or the unions, try to influence that process along the way with the agencies and with the governor's office as well, to try to get that put in the initial budget. And then there's the public facing side, as Gordon mentioned, when it gets to the legislature, and then the Joint Finance Committee does hearings around the state as well, usually 3 or 4 or 5, depending on who's leading it. There's public hearings around the state where the public can come comment on it.
Scott, you're chomping at the.
Only as Dr. Ford knows, I teach advocacy at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And one of the things I teach is the earlier you get in the process, the better you are, the better off you are, which means it's not just knowing the right legislator. It's not putting all the votes together. It's knowing which agency to deal with. And in many cases, it may not even be the secretary of a department, it may be further down. So it's finding those key people, which is also why people that work with various interest groups are valuable, because they know the people in each of these agencies. They know who to go to. They know the process.
Gordon, one, you look like you want to respond to that, but two, you were on the Joint Committee on Finance. That's one of the more important roles. And I don't think people really understand what the Budget Committee does and how
Yep.
important that is.
So after the governor introduces the budget, usually in January or February of the odd numbered year, the Joint Finance Committee takes up the budget, and the Finance Committee is made up of 8 senators and 8 assembly people, with a majority based on partisan majorities. We really are, to learn the state budget is to serve on the Joint Finance Committee. You're given sort of a document that says, here's what the Department of Transportation does. It's responsible for X amount of highways, X amount of county roads, X amount of local roads. It does all of these things. I mean, it's like going to law school, being on joint finance, and I've never been to law school, but you are reading about all of these programs, and then you get to a specific program and it says, you know, in the last budget, here's what the state did. The governor said we should do this. And then they also write about what they've heard from maybe Republicans and what they've heard from Democrats as options for us to do. So in many ways, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, the one who writes this amazing Bible that probably only people like this panel, including Mike Ford, would enjoy, you know, has undue influence on the whole process, because they're the ones that are giving us the options that are really telling the story of what the state budget's about. Here's what we do. Here are some challenges. Here are some things to consider. Here are some things the agency has said are going to, you know, we're going to have problems filling jobs. We're going to see oil prices are going to soar. We're going to see, you know, COVID continue to have an impact. All of those things are going to be considerations for legislators to make. But all of the information that we're reading is done by an unelected bureaucratic agency. And that, I think, is something that, you know, they're all incredibly bright and well respected. But that's a part of being on the joint finance. We go item by item through a budget over the course of 6 months. It does include public hearings, and a lot of those things are issues that get more of the public attention, or that maybe there's more muscle behind in terms of well-financed lobbyists, or that have bigger considerations. But it also has the Kickapoo Valley Reserve funding, which I didn't know about until I got on joint finance.
And
Go ahead,
Wisconsin, I think, is fairly unique in having this joint finance committee. It's very powerful. A lot of states, other states, there's just different models. Every state has different a model. And some state legislatures will have their they divide the budget up by subject, and it's divvied up. And then like the transportation budget is Department of Transportation budget is sent to the Transportation Committee. The public service commissions would be sent to the Energy Committee, and then it goes through that committee, and then respectively goes through the houses that way. Wisconsin consolidates it all into one massive document and puts it on a very powerful committee that, you know, is that's what a lot of people aspire to be on, because there's a lot of power. And then you have to work with your colleagues who you're usually assigned a budget buddy, right? They're given a topic to cover on the Joint Finance Committee, and you're given a budget buddy, so forth, so that you know who to go to. Like you're covering education and healthcare, right? So that's how legislators also lobby. You were lobbied by your colleagues when you're on.
We're lobbied by
finance.
the colleagues. I hadn't heard of the budget buddy.
Oh,
Did you have those?
We did, because if you're serving on the Joint Finance Committee, it's kind of it's an honor, but you're representing your colleagues in the legislature. And so when they have questions,
Yeah.
or they have points, or they have fights, they're coming to you and it's your responsibility to brief them. And so sort of as a pre-organizational way, we have budget buddies, meaning if you need to talk about the UW system, go talk to, Representative Hintz.
Now I say things have changed, and I find this very interesting. When I was on Finance Committee, we're vastly outnumbered as Republicans. So there's 7 Democrats in the Senate and 7 in the Assembly. I was the only Republican senator, and Mike Ellis from up in Appleton was the only Assembly person. So if he had to step out of the room for a minute, I wouldn't get seconds for my motions. So we had no buddies. And he said, but we had subcommittees on finance,
Okay.
which I found very valuable, because if you do your homework on those, it becomes less partisan. And that is one thing I did find in finance. If you really do your homework, you can sway debate over a number of issues by having good information.
I'll say budget buddy sounds like some horrible doll I'm gonna get my kids for Christmas and disappoint them.
But that you would have.
That I would have, well, yeah, I have a couple of those, right? Somebody with a pocket protector. So Scott, your role as governor during this process, I mean, so what do you, right, you start the process, you give your little speech to everybody, and then it goes to Joint Committee on Finance. What are you doing during that time?
Well, you've got, first of all, you've got policy staff,
Yeah.
as well as DOA staff, and working with Fiscal Bureau. I looked at it, I came in kind of late to the game and had a huge hole that I had to fill, a deficit in a very short period. I also had, which I don't think either of you had to do, I had a Democrat Senate and a Republican Assembly. And you have to get the same budget through both houses. And in my case, leadership, it was a big story in the newspapers when I had leadership actually meet in my office together. They disliked each other that much. So my concern was getting a budget through.
So I was, when that was Speaker Guard. And
No, as Scott Jensen was
Oh,
Speaker
Jensen.
and Chuck Qualla.
Wow, okay. So
Both
I
of who
was,
ended
yeah,
up
I
being
remember that.
prosecuted later.
I remember that. So I was, so after I practiced law, I was chief of staff and legal counsel to the speaker. And so during that time, and then when you became governor, and it went to conference committee, which we haven't seen in a long time, because it was a Democrat Senate and a Republican legislature, and they couldn't agree. So then
Can you explain what that is, conference committee?
So it passed both houses, the budget passed both houses, but in different forms. So then what do you do? So then we've got they have a committee, representatives from each house to try to hammer out the details, so we don't have to start from scratch all over again. And so it was Chuck Koala and Scott Jensen at the conference committee, and they didn't get along. And that tradition carried on for quite a bit, because when I still was in the speaker's office, then it was Speaker Guard and Mary Panzer and others. And, those were Republicans, and they didn't get along with each other. So it doesn't always have to be the same different parties, but the budget's a contentious process. But yeah, the conference committee, we haven't seen that in a while. I don't know if we ever.
No, and you can learn a lot as well by following. Congress has the same type of thing.
They do.
And I had a similar issue to it you see in Congress now, when you don't have a large majority, as we didn't have in the Assembly at the time, you need every vote. And if you don't have every vote, so it's really interesting to see the politics. I say interesting in, as I've always said, I really enjoyed the job. The only thing I didn't like about politics is there's too much politics involved. But to get the votes, I mean, I could tell stories on people who supposedly were conservative, but I needed their vote. And yeah, they're conservative, but they sure needed the funding for this. It's like, I thought I thought we were spending too much. Yeah, but I needed in this.
The other thing is there's a lot going on behind the scenes in that 6-month period. I mean, if you had started over again and said, what's the budget process? The governor introduces the budget. The Joint Finance Committee, made up of 16 legislators, has hearings around the state and goes item by item through the budget, passes a budget, and then the Assembly and the Senate pass a budget and the governor signs it, period. But, what's going on behind the scenes as well, because the Joint Finance Committee is only 16 legislators, but we know that's 16 out of 132, 33 senators and 99 assembly people, and they represent all different parts of the state. And so they're paying attention. And there are times that finance passes a budget and it comes to the full house and they're like, whoa, oh, no. I'm not voting for this. And all of a sudden they don't have the votes to pass it through the Assembly or the Senate. And then it has to get changed again. Now you hope to spill blood on the front end, meaning the expression that you make the hard decisions behind the scenes or early enough in the process to avoid those kind of things. But sometimes that doesn't occur. So you can imagine that's when maybe one party controls everything. My first term in office was in the minority, but the Democrats held the Senate and we had a Democratic governor. The budget is supposed to be done by June 30th of an odd numbered year for 2 years. And it didn't get done till I think the third week of October. Now we didn't, but our state just runs on the existing budget. It doesn't just, in Minnesota, if they don't get a budget passed, the state shuts down. It's kind of like the federal government, these shutdowns that you read about. So, there's a lot of complicated things going on behind the scenes, just aimed at arriving at a majority that it would take to ultimately pass things.
And Wisconsin doesn't shut down.
Right.
Which is a really key point. And I'll just share again, some of the things you have to deal with, first of all, behind the scenes. When I was in Joint Finance Committee, being the only Republican from the Senate, you had to kind of carry water for the governor. And there are times I really didn't.
I've carried water.
Yeah, well, it's in times it made you very uncomfortable having to do it, but you're the only one there and you're representing a lot of other. And I do remember Governor Dreyfus having something and I went to bat for him on something I didn't like, and then he changed on it. And there I am hanging out. So it puts you in awkward positions at times. But with this as well, with the office and the things you have to do as governor to get those votes sometimes is so you see it with the legislature in the finance committee. I mean, I needed the votes and I'd have conservatives say, we ought to shut it down. Shut it down. We shouldn't, you need to do that. Be tough. I said, but that's not the way it works. In Wisconsin, if we don't compromise and get what I'm looking to try to balance the budget, spending goes up. What do you mean it goes up? Because we've got so many formulas that spending automatically goes up in the state. So unless we compromise to bring, well, no, we got to shut it down. Well, you can't. But it's, so even with legislators, you understood that in finance committee and but not everybody fully understands
but
it.
You're getting more of that. You're getting more legislators saying that we should, well, who cares then? Just let the budget. I mean, I know that, when Governor Evers was asked, well, why did you sign the budget? It had a lot of things in there that weren't great. It was passed by Republican legislators. He had a fear that they wouldn't pass a budget, that there were enough legislators who would say, let's just run on last year's budget. It's, it'd be more frugal.
Yeah,
But it's not totally last year's. It's the formulas from the previous years.
correct. There's built-in, yeah.
So built-in increases.
So all of you, we keep, and I think the crowd's picking up on this. We can talk about the logistics of the budgetary process, but ultimately it's political. It's the place you've had to suffer through my classes. I always like to say resources finite, needs are infinite, values are contested. And the budget's where we sort all that out. So politics comes into play. So I'm curious, and I'll turn to you, Ellen, because you've had a couple of different roles. Is it healthy for it to be that political? Is it inevitable?
I don't know how there's so much money at stake
Yeah.
and there's so much more passion these days about things. I don't know how you unwind it.
Yeah.
Unless you make some things more formulaic and but is it healthy? Probably not, but
Yeah.
I don't know how you make it less political. There are some states that do it, we basically pass 2 one-year budgets and combine it, right? We don't pass the spending for 2 years. It's two one-year budgets combined into a biennial budget. And I think I actually think that's a good formula. I mean, you need some longer certainty to things. Some states do just annual budgets, and I don't know how you'd ever get out of a cycle of politicalness. Gordon mentioned, work on the next budget begins right away. It does more behind the scenes and within the agencies, but there is a lull time, and I think that's healthy for people to get away from it. But I don't know how you make it less. It's there's a lot of money at stake, and it's gonna get people excited.
Yeah, and on that note, I'm not trying to imply that political means bad, but we're here on a college campus, and the two issues that always seem to come up at the end is UW system,
Yeah.
K-12 education. So I guess, Gordon, why is that? Why are those always so contentious?
I think it's been more in more recent times. The UW system and K-12 education used to be pretty big budget winners, and things like K-12 education and transportation used to be both policy winners and political winners. Policy winners because people like well-funded classrooms that their kids go to school in, and they like fewer potholes. And political winners because, the teachers union used to have a lot of strength pre-Act 10, and the road builders spend a tremendous amount of political capital, on campaigns. And so, you could be seen as, do we need that triple double overpass that, when you're going through Wausau that takes you on the 29? I don't know. I don't have to stop anymore at the Starbucks there. It's nice.
It's the road to Jerry's office as well. And as the benefactor of the Whitburn Center, I'm fully in favor of that.
So, I would say the dynamics have changed about who has what power and why. And then the ideological perception, I think, seems to be one that's hurting the UW system, more than others. And then on the K-12 side, I would say at the legislative level over the last decade, the number one political force in legislative politics has been the school privatization movement. Over the last 20 years, we spent 2.5 times more money on privatizing public education in this state than we have on the UW system. You can say that out loud a couple times. It's pretty insane. I don't think you'd find another state in the country that's done anything that dumb to cripple their number one economic engine. And I'm not meaning to get political. I'm just saying I've looked at the 20.
But you did.
Well, but I've looked at
Scott,
I've then looked at the 20-year numbers. I'm just saying the decline in support for K-12 education publicly has come at the same time there's been a massive rise in taxpayer subsidized private schools.
Scott, you can respond directly to that.
I don't think you want to get me going on this.
One of the beautiful things we're doing here in the Whitburn Center is we want to be able to bring Republicans and Democrats.
I didn't think I said anything to.
And I think it goes a lot deeper in a number of the areas in our present political arena as well. It's not just the spending. And I would say there's an attempt to look at output as well as input, that putting more money in doesn't always mean getting better education. So that debate will take place. But there's also, we're increasingly getting into parents' ability to become involved in schools, which used to be the important thing. What is being taught in the schools and what direction the schools are taking. That is a real underlying, and you look and you study school boards, and you work in one of your offices is very close to Lodi, which is a hotbed nationally of what is happening in school boards now with critical race theory. These are tied in to school funding, and as you can see very directly, being tied in with university funding, because you lump those two together. So I think it's more than just the funding of education. It's become much more aligned with what is happening socially in the US and in the state, involving a number of other issues.
And I think you're hitting on why the budget process is so is political, why we get so passionate about it, because it involves our day-to-day lives and involves these contentious issues, just based on this conversation up here.
Yeah, and I would say that my main point on my point before was that the state budget is like a balloon, and if you squeeze from one side, it gets bigger, on another side. And 20 years ago, we weren't spending money on statewide voucher expansion. Whether it's a good idea or not is a totally, that's for another debate. But you've introduced something new to the table, and it's come at the expense of something. And in this case, it's the UW system. We've been able to increase our transportation budget, not because we have increased the transportation revenues, because we've taken general fund revenue, right? And that's great when you've got a good economic times and there's plenty of sales tax and income tax. But what happens when the income tax and the sales tax dries up? Are we going to fund roads? Are we going to fund schools? Because you're going to have those kind of choices that we haven't had to make the last two budgets. Everybody's happy because the road builders got all of their money, but they didn't get it from the gas tax or from, registration fees. They got it from general fund, which has traditionally been there for schools.
The last budget was a bit of an anomaly because of the massive, massive surplus that the state has, due to a variety of reasons, tax collections, COVID, pandemic relief dollars coming in. And so it was odd to be, watch that budget process because it was not a fight over the scarcity of the dollars so much this last budget time. So that was a little different. I don't think we're going to see that.
And maybe we ought to just kind of share, the budget isn't one pot of money. There are different funds
Yeah,
that go into the budget.
Yeah, why don't you, I know you were writing this down. Where's the money coming from?
Well, you've got the general purpose revenues, which we tend to think of the allocatable funds, which come from income tax, big ones, sales tax, corporate income tax are the three big ones. And then there's some other things with it. So those are general purpose revenues. You've got federal funds, and that's where the big one-time funding came. And many of these are earmarked for things. They have to go to specific things. But in this case, with COVID, there was a great deal of flexibility. So again, that creates a lot of debate in the legislature and a lot of political debate where anytime there's money, there's going to be debate on something. Check with your own family. And then you've got segregated fees, and you've got program revenues are the big pots. Program revenues, think of parks, state parks, pay fees, program revenues go into that. It used to be with the gas tax, used to be a segregated fund. It still is a segregated fund, although they're dipping into the general funds for it. But you've got these different pots of funding that you have to deal with. Big one, the taxes you look at is general purpose revenue.
So we've talked a little bit about interest groups. All of you have mentioned that to a degree. And I'm just curious, what level of involvement do interest groups have? And I know that people kind of cringe when they hear it, but I think it was Ellen who was saying that it serves a functional purpose. So I'm curious to hear what role you think they're playing and whether that's a good, healthy thing for our democracy here in Wisconsin.
I think everyone likes, they dislike interest groups except their own, because it's true. I mean, they serve a very necessary purpose because it's a more efficient way to convey your messages to your legislators and policymakers. Whether it's ARP or a truck driver association, that's how they speak for their members. Individual truck drivers are out doing their job every day. They don't have time to pay attention to the day-to-day stuff happening in the Capitol and what new rules might be written by the Department of Transportation or whatnot, or pay attention to the minutia of the timing of the budget process, so that they have an organization, an association for it that pays attention to that and then visits the legislature, visits the lobbyists, brings those particular members in when they need to. And I think that's why you see if there's a hearing on a bill, you might see the association's representative there, but oftentimes they bring people in from the association themselves. They take a day off of work and they speak in front of the committee and they come and talk. And I think that's how that process should work. Do some have more influence than others? Yeah. I mean, that's true of every single state in this country and in the federal government. But I always kind of like, everyone's like, it's a lobbyist. I'm like, but they're speaking for a group of people that otherwise wouldn't be able to have that voice there. And that's the purpose they serve. And I think it's a good purpose.
And we could also, when I'm done, I'm going to turn to Gordon to give a different perspective. From an individual legislator's perspective, it's like anything else in life. You can be driven by lobbyists or you can use them. I find that good lobbyists, and there's a big difference.
Yeah.
Good lobbyists provide information on both sides. They give the pros and cons. They're a great source of information. They do a lot of work for you. There are others that will just get, and you learn which ones. There may be some legislators that listen that way. And I know it's very helpful in finance committee to hear both sides. And there are others that may take the word, or this is an important group, and just follow along what they say. So everybody's going to be different in this. Now, there's another overlay, because when you think of lobbyists, you think cigars, money being handed out. And that's why I'd like to turn to leadership, somebody who's served in leadership, because part of the job is to raise money for people that are running for office. And there are different lobby groups that tend to back either Republicans or Democrat and tend to be your supporters. Although I found as governor that I thought leaders could have easily switched sides. They didn't care about the issue as much in this case. I mean, it may have been unique. And you know the two I'm talking about. They're both ended up in court. But they could have switched sides as long as they could have raised money. And a good example comes to mind is chiropractors and physicians are always at odds and things. Okay, I'll take the chiropractors. I'll raise their and take money from them this time, and you take the physicians. So some of that does, but again, it depends on the legislator. And I think leadership has a different responsibility as well, because it is becoming, it's becoming so expensive to run for office that it's, I mean, what it costs now for assembly and Senate races is just mind boggling to me. And
You don't want to know.
no, it's that. And I did have somebody talk to me
Say
not too long ago about
lots.
running for office.
Cheaper.
And he said, I've got people coming and think you ought to get in again. I said, okay. I said, let them know I will do it. But I want to see 5 million from each person who says that, because that's what it's, and you know, you need, I need 10 people at least from this to get it, even to get to the starting gate nowadays.
Jeez.
I mean, and a lot of it isn't on the books. A lot of it is
sure.
from independent groups.
What he's talking about
Yeah,
is the,
independent group.
yeah.
Go ahead,
because-
Gordon.
Yeah.
Yeah, but from leadership's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Same. Also not on the books.
Yeah.
The relationship between power and money and lobbying and campaign finance, I always just describe as more complicated and less like we think it is. It's just not as cut and dry as someone shows up with a bag of money, drops it off, tells you to vote a certain way, and that's it. You know, it's just not, there's not a guy in a dark trench coat handing out cigars. You know, but when we say lobbyists, I think that's the first thing that we sort of think of. The reality is we couldn't do our jobs. I don't have time to go talk to 99 people in the assembly, but lobbyists do, right? So when they come to me and say, I need 5 more of your members, do you know who it would be worth talking to? Because if I'm in there and say, well, look, if you can get 5 more members, you know, then fine. You know, it's either a vote that I'm not, you know, it's going to pass one way or another, or I don't care about. The Brewers Stadium would probably be a good one. They wanted to have bipartisan support. You know, they didn't want it to be all Democrats or all Republicans. Well, they needed to have Republicans on it, but, you know, they were going to need Democratic votes to do it. And that was probably pretty complicated behind the scenes on figuring out who those people were ultimately going to be. I think it depends on the issue. I mean, Ellen's right that you're talking about billions of dollars that are at stake for some of these programs, especially when you talk about infrastructure, which is really good. It's really good for our state's economy to have great infrastructure. And I speak for someone who works for the laborers. And I know this, getting our transportation, we make things in Wisconsin, getting them through Milwaukee to Chicago, getting them to market is incredibly important. You know, that being said, there's a lot at stake for those groups out there that make our roads. And so you can say, well, yeah, is it being done because they're big, powerful lobbyists? I guess, but you could also say it's done because it's really good for our state. And those become, complicated issues. I'll give you one example of another one. I got a call from somebody who said, I talked to somebody who borrowed $300 from a payday lender, a check cash placed, and they ended up, paying like $3,900 when it all was said and done. And they said there ought to be a law. And I said, you're right, there ought to be a law. I'm going to take on the payday lenders. And they registered 31 lobbyists against my legislation. The payday lending industry had 31 lobbyists. Well, do you know how many lobbyists the non-payday lending group had? 0. Because people who get smoked and lose all their money and lose all their home and lose their everything because of payday lenders don't have lobbyists, right? They don't have anything. They don't even vote, right? So how do you compete in a system where you have 0 organization and 0 resources and you're going up against billionaires from out of state? So that's where you've got to be, and yet we were still able to get some things done, but largely by pulling back the curtain.
And in some cases, I mean, even the media isn't helpful. I know in one case, I had several major supporters in something, and I decided, even though they're supporters and donors, I was going to go the other way. And the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel wrote an article how McCallum doesn't stick up for his donors. It was AT&T.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
AT&T and the telecommunications industry.
Was it good for you politically?
Well, it's not nice it doesn't help you politically to have your anybody who donates thinks I'm going to do the opposite thing that they want me to
Scott
do.
McCallum can't be bought.
Was the argument I used, but
There you go.
I'm just saying it's tough to reach everybody. In those days, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel had a circulation.
I got Scott to come here and I gave him water, like literally nothing. He can be bought. He's cheap. Come on. So sorry,
Don't underestimate hydration.
hydration is important. Expanding on the point you made there, Gordon, like I hear you. And I remember the day I woke up and realized that I was a lobbyist. Like I was like, I'm not a lobbyist. I'm just the guy that goes talks to the legislature about policy. And it's like, no, you're a lobbyist. And they weren't letting me in there because of my charisma, right? I worked for an organization. So how does a regular person influence the budgetary process?
So, I mean, at the end of the day, like I said, now that the teachers union's largely been dismantled in Wisconsin, public education still remains popular because parents send their kids there. And when parents call their legislator and say, hey, you should support this school funding proposal, it still matters. It still represents somebody, the type of person that exists out there. When the Joint Finance Committee, we do these hearings around the state, or did do those hearings around the state, we heard from everyday people who are largely, some of them were organized by lobbying groups, the American Association for Retired Persons would be in the front row with their red t-shirts on at every single hearing, trying to be a force out there for the issues that they wanted to see, that they thought that were the most important to them. I'll be honest with you, constituent contacts have declined towards the end of my career. And some of that, I think, is because of the loss of traditional media. I think it's harder for people to follow what's happening in Madison. I think a lot of you are probably finding this to be really complicated, not only because it is, but because it's harder to follow. That'd be, the end of my 16 years, what changed the most in terms that impacts democracy would be the decline of traditional media that covers what happens at the legislative level. We've got good resources covering local politics. You can still catch the national news, but I don't think you can follow what the press corps when I got to Madison was probably 15, 20 people. And by the end, I think it was 4, 5 maybe.
Yeah.
I'd go in there and be like, are any of you going to cover this? And they'd
and
be
now
like,
it's-
they look at me and they go, we don't have
And
it.
now it'll change even more. I see Sports Illustrated got rid of their report. They're going with AI. So it's going to be written by
So,
AI.
I know I went off topic, but I mean, yes, it still matters, but it is also harder for, I think, the average person to engage than it's ever been. And that has a cost to democracy.
And their trade-offs. And that's back to your very first question to Ellen that we kind of followed up on a little bit. But what is a better system? As those in political science know, the best system is a benevolent dictatorship. So democracy, or in our case, representative government, is messy. And you can let it happen to you, or you can understand it and be part of it. And for a democracy or a representative government to survive, it needs to have people involved. It needs to have the public involved with the space, or the others are going to take over.
Go ahead, Ellen.
But, I hear what you're saying, Gordon, about it being harder to follow what's going on. But at the same time, in some respects it is, because the traditional media is non-existent. I mean, there's just not enough of them to cover what's going on. But there's, but that's again where your groups pay attention. And for someone to contact your legislator now, it couldn't be easier. You just sit at home and click a button. And if there's Facebook ads, click here, do this. There's digital ads when you're visiting things. There's, there's so many more types of ways to reach the public to try to influence your legislator about something. There's Wisconsin Eye, which, if you want to sit and watch paint dry, you can watch.
But I'd be interested in their ratings. I just think
I
it's
know.
quite- it went down every year I was
It-
in office.
Yeah, but that's the transparency though, that, didn't exist 20 years ago. When it took a while to get it off the ground, but it was about, Margaret Farrell was a huge champion of that. And when I was in the speaker's office, we helped get that through. Yeah. And, it's a great tool. So in some respects it is harder, but then I think that is, if you have an interest in an issue, go to the legislature's website, click on who is my legislator, you type in your address, boom, it pops right up, tells you their names. You can go right and contact them. You can also search to say, is it something related to healthcare? You can go on easily and find an association that probably represents that policy, and contact them and see if they've done anything on it. See if they've registered on any bills on it, written any papers on it. There are ways for you to maximize your power, not just as an individual, but through a group of like-minded people. And if there's a topic, there's probably a group up for it. There's an association for almost everything these days.
Yeah. As I say, the process is the same. Players change within it. The way to advocate for yourself changes within it, which is why you need professors like Dr. Ford to continue.
This is why I love budgeting, because I think students have the lowest expectations, but they tend to leave kind of like, oh, it's kind of exciting to know where the money's coming from and where the money's going. My professional development pitch is always, you can be the smartest person in the room, even if you're not really the smartest person in the room, if you know how to answer these questions. And
I think
interpret these
probably
questions.
all of us up here as well have become very jaded on when something happens, it's what's behind it.
Yeah.
Where's the money? Who's driving this? Is it money? What is it? And that's probably one thing that come out of the political.
How do we combat that? I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. And I keep thinking of that. We had a thing a couple months ago about a crisis of engagement. And it's just,
But why come? It occurs everywhere.
yeah.
It's better to learn it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about that. It happens in business. Why are they pushing this angle? Why are they doing that? Why does my wife want this?
No, but yeah, Governor McCallum's wife is in the room. So,
Sorry.
um, what would you change? And I'll turn to you, Gordon. You can respond to that too, if you'd like to. But what, if you were king, what would you change about the budget process to make it healthier, make it people more engaged in it?
I think the changes that I'd want to see aren't so much to the budget process. I'd love to talk to Scott some more. There's nothing worse than talking to legislators from a different era that you feel was a better era still, where things were more transparent or could get done, because the politics were better, I think, to some extent. I don't know. I mean, some of what's happened nationally that's pervaded, been pervasive into the state, I think has been hard. But to me, having more, I should say, Ellen's right that it's never been easier to contact your legislator. It's never been easier to organize around an issue. But I would love to see, daily press accessible to people who are reading a newspaper. I mean, when I first ran for office, there was 5 days a week local editorial content in the Oshkosh Northwestern. 5 days a week, they had someone writing about local issues or state issues. They don't have any editorial
Chris
content
Cressy, Ted
anymore.
Miller and.
You know, and they had someone. So to me, you know, the best thing about the budget process would be information for the public. Because we could have given this presentation anytime in the last 40 years, and it would have had a very, you know, some of it would have variations, but the budget process is complicated enough, but it's got to be easier to follow. And I think that's the part where it's hard. And yes, you can sign up for probably email links and briefings, and you can have a friend watch Wisconsin Eye with you. I just don't know in today's world how realistic some of that is. I think it gets back to, you know, local journalism. And I guess I'll die on that hill.
Can't argue with you on that one. Ellen, what do you think?
If I were queen for a day, yeah, I probably too would get rid of like the social media, and that probably cure a lot of other ills in our society as well. But you know, it's along the lines of what Gordon said, because it would force people, I think, to actually report in more detail rather than pithy comments or, you know, what's going to get the most clicks on something. You know, we probably all remember the days when Dick Wheeler ran that media room, and he would do daily reports on what was happening. I mean, these are your dollars, like, and whether you sign up as an individual or through your association, again, it was very detailed. Here's what happened in the budget today. And he put it in plain language, and it was great. And, you know, we just don't have anyone being that. It comes now through the lens of your association or the spin of a particular party. And that's what's unfortunate, that, you know, there's too much. You know, I wish I could change. There's too many, well, now 12-4 votes. There's too many partisan votes on Joint Finance Committee. When most of the stuff in the state budget is nonpartisan. But, you know, you got to vote with the party all the time. That, you know, that's why I'm never going to run for office, because you know, I'm a Republican, but I wouldn't vote, you know, there's times when you need to be part of the team and not. And, you know, Gordon, you probably ran into that as minority leader. You want your team to be there, but at the same time, you're there to represent your constituents. And there's less and less of that. People are just representing the party now. And that is conveyed in the budget.
Yeah, and it strikes me too. I mean, that's the one thing that really you could have bipartisanship, because it's the one thing that has to pass. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a reason that so many of our major policy initiatives, even though we're not supposed to have policy in the budget, we all know we do.
Yeah.
It's a reason it occurs during the budgetary process. And since you brought up partisanship, and we happen to have a former high-ranking Republican governor and a former high-ranking Democrat here on stage, I mean, what was the role of partisanship during the budgetary process during your time, and were there those bipartisan moments?
Well, it depends on what issues we're talking about, but and who specifically, because there are hardliners, as you can see in Congress now, it's playing out. There are those that are hardliners that won't compromise on anything. They want their way, and you get on both sides. No matter what you do, they want their way or the highway. And it's difficult to have compromise with that. I obviously had to compromise, but you know, I'm, you know, nowadays I'm probably considered a rhino.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
because we don't follow on exactly every.
What's a rhino, Scott?
I consider you both rhinos.
That's a Republican in
read
name
college.
only. It's meant to be an insult. If you're a
It's
hardcore
considered
Republican.
an insult. And as I've said, you know, it's
Yeah.
like one of the major groups that is a Republican, huge interest group. The word came out after one specific situation that you can't trust McCallum. Well, it's because I didn't back them on everything they wanted. Therefore, I became untrustworthy. So it's really the core of democracy. We can talk about social media, but it's here. And it's just like we say with populism. And as you know, my research has been on what is happening not only with populism in the US, but worldwide. And it's not the person, it's the underlying causes that we need to address. And that's the issue in a lot of this. And I'm not sure how we get, it's like when I first came into the legislature, I was asked, is it a full-time or part-time legislature? And I said, well, it was designed as part-time, it's going full-time, and I don't know how we get back. And I think we've got social media, it's not going to go away. So how do you have it so it allows free speech and a fairness as a public forum? And it's a frustration I've shared on the academic side to academic side is I ask students, where do you get your information? And I've actually had students, they tell me, and I said, well, in this class, you're gonna have to learn to understand both sides. And I've had people quit because of that. They don't want to understand the other side because it's complicated. It's tough to reach compromise with that.
What do you think, Gordon?
We already said the rule on the finance, well, in general, the majority gets their way, the minority gets their say. And as long as, that is kind of the rules, on the budget committee, as long as there were no last minute, you got the time to read the amendments, that the process was fair, that it was transparent, that the ranking members or that the chairman chair and chairwoman of the committee that we had at the time, ran the committee smoothly, gave you your equal time. That's the best that you can ask for. And we were given that. And there were plenty of times, where we would get bipartisan things done. As a member of the minority party, if I wanted to get something done, I knew I had to give it to somebody in the majority party and I could draft it and have it done. And I was more than happy to play the game to get it done. I think in general on partisanship, it gets complicated. When Governor Evers was elected in 2018, and then less than a month later, before he was even sworn in, we took away powers that he had as the executive in the executive branch and took away powers from the attorney general. As an American, I had a hard time stomaching that. I mean, it was disgraceful, disgusting, and an absolute insult to our democracy.
There's a former governor who spoke out against that and called for bipartisanship. And being that person, I can tell you what happened with social media on both sides. You get torn to shreds on both sides.
Well, you can trust Scott McCallum on that one.
Well, I mean, that's what happened.
I-
Who's willing to?
But I'm saying it was hard. It was hard to just say, okay, no problem, you guys. This is just another issue. You're dismantling the infrastructure of how a democracy is supposed to function. I mean, this is stuff that people went and died for, and what we were just supposed to do, and just say, no problem. When we start back up in January, it's going to be fine.
I mean, I think you're
I mean,
speaking.
I can look at that. I had no respect for anybody. I mean, I told, the speaker will go down in history as a disgraced figure for that.
See, and I thought there ought to have been discussions with it. It was a rare opportunity to try to reverse the trend of what is occurring. And it's occurred here as it has in every state and many other countries as well. But it's a lot deeper than some of these things. It's really driving at the institutions themselves. And that's my concern.
But that's the
what's
thing you
happening
can't
to people.
change. I mean, the thing that's supposed to hold us together is the process, right? There has to be rules. There has to be an institution. There has to be in the same thing that we're having this debate. We're having this debate at the national level about our elections. I mean, these are the things that have to hold. And right down to our budget process needs to hold as well. There has to be a process. There has to be accountability. There has to be transparency, and there has to be rules for how we do these things. And I think the minute you start whittling away at those, the minute, there's some real serious concerns.
I agree.
Yeah. And any response, Ellen, to that? Or?
No, it's just in the process. I mean, once you erode the public's trust in that process, and, it will come back to bite. I think both sides have been guilty of overstepping their bounds and trying to manipulate the rules. And, Gordon's right. The rules have to stand. And whether you're in the minority or in the majority, you have to abide by them. And, it is frustrating, I'm sure, to be a member of the minority. But the rules are there to protect the voice that they need to have. And they're also there to protect the overstepping of the majority. And whether it's, I gave a talk yesterday morning. I still do some work with the National Association of Utility Regulators. And I talk a lot about the importance of the independence of regulatory commissioners. And why is that important? I said, it's so people can trust the process. They can trust the outcome and trust who's making those decisions. And that's why you have to have, the structure in place. And, we start to erode structure
And trust.
and trust.
That's.
It is, difficult for someone who spent 18 years in public service to see what is happening now. And I'm happy to be in the private sector. So
Well, and while we can say
I'm gonna s-
Republicans in one case, but I'll tell you how many times I hear Republicans were going to do this, and I say, well, I don't think we ought to do this. It's hurting the system. And they say, well, the Democrats did it.
I know.
And
It's the- what it-
bothers me.
yeah,
Yeah, they did. And I didn't like it when they did
I
it.
know.
Why am I going to like it when we do it?
the
But
hypocrisy.
we've
is-
gone into
yeah.
that spiral.
Yeah.
And that's why I thought the start was an opportunity to change the spiral when Evers came in, but neither side was willing to talk with the other. Neither side.
And I want to get to questions in a second, but to Ellen's point, I mean, what she just said, I mean, that breaks my heart to think someone dedicates that much time and energy to public service and then, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was time, I was ready to go,
Yeah.
but I mean, and I, if anyone here is thinking about doing public service, I enjoyed it immensely. And it's absolutely rewarding. You get to see some really exciting things and be at the pulse of things happening right away. You get to have a lot of influence on stuff that impacts the entire state.
Yeah.
But it was much different from when I started in 2000. Well, I started in 94 for a while, and I worked for Mark Green. Remember that? Yeah. And then, then basically serving in the minority on the Public Service Commission. It's different. I saw a full evolution when I was in the speaker's office. We worked a lot with Democrats. I don't know that that's happening as much right now to reach across the aisle.
No, it's,
Because we had Governor Doyle, so we had to reach a deal. And it's different now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I shouldn't have made that personal about you, Ellen. I really think about students and people that
Yeah.
want to get involved in public service that
Yeah.
I don't want people thinking this isn't for me.
No,
Well,
it's rewarding.
it is.
It's amazing.
I always think, I mean, any job you have has goods and
Yeah,
bad things. And
Yeah.
as wife knows, I always put percentages. I say 80% of the time, I wouldn't have traded the job of governor for anything.
yeah.
It's just so rewarding. I mean, I
It
love
is.
groundbreakings and ribbon because it's success and it's really fun to see this. And I thought every day I'm going, seeing something and I'm learning and and they're paying me for it. What a neat thing. The other 20%, I would have traded it for anything.
Yeah.
And as I've said, if there are a number of times, and Lori reminds me of this, if I ever thought of running again, the number of days I said, I think I've died and gone to hell. I'm living there. It's, there's some really nasty things that occur. So you gotta be kind of tough in it. And especially with the social media now, but for anything, an athlete,
Yeah.
anybody in that, it's what's happened. Problem is with the social media, isn't the social media itself, it's the things that can be said that you don't know whether you can believe it or not anymore.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
information.
And it's
Yeah.
getting worse with AI. So voices and
Yeah.
images and all of these things can be copied. But it's a societal issue. We're a democracy, so you can use it. You can use it as they do, and I mean, Putin's as popular as he's ever been now. They control it all. China, they control it now. So it's how we're able to utilize it to maintain a representative form of government.
Any quick comments, Gordon? Or I was going to turn it over to the crowd for
Let's turn it over.
Q&A. Anybody have any questions?
Did we put everybody to sleep with the
We
budget
tried.
talk?
They're still awake. A couple of my students get extra credit for here, so they're here against their will. Any questions for our panelists here? I can keep asking them. Yeah, go ahead. Here. Why don't you? Yeah.
Mike, give up the mic.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Marcus. It's nice to hear you guys talk about issues that are important to Wisconsin, us as we live here. But I had a question more about you guys talking about public service, and you, Governor, said that you would trade it 80% of the time. You loved it 20% of the time. You would trade it for anything. And more about public service. You know, you guys served maybe in the 90s, early 2000s, and obviously since then our political climate and the things we use, you know, to run elections and do campaigns have changed. If you were giving advice to somebody that's going into public service now, what would be a piece of advice?
And I just think we need good people in government, good, honest people. Because a downward spiral, when people see it from the outside and they think it's bad, you just get bad people going in. So I encourage anyone who wants to reform or wants to do good to get involved in the political arena and use your influence, because that's the only way to keep the system we've got. So that's what I mean, it can be very rewarding depending on where you go in, but whatever you do, but that's the case for any job. I mean, just do as best you can and be a good person. I mean, I tell you, I also teach, as Dr. Ford knows, I also teach leadership in Milwaukee. And I spent a fair amount of time, not just on other leaders and leadership steps and what research says, but you need to have a philosophical grounding. So people are required, they can take their choice, but they have to read Plato or Socrates or Aurelius or just somebody asked me this last time, can I have Jesus? Is what? Yes, you share it with the class, but I want to know as a leader, the philosophical groundings. And if you've got that, whatever you do in life, in the political arena as well, I think it allows you to not be swayed by negative things. You do what you are grounded in. But different people are grounded in different things, which I also talk about in leadership. Some, I can tell you political decisions I made that were wrong politically. I knew it. Politically, they were wrong. Gambling issue comes to mind, the amount of money that went in that. I couldn't inside do something different. I was asked because it became public afterwards, you know, what do you think? And I said, the difference is I can look at in the mirror in the morning. And they said, oh, yeah. And I said, well, understand, my opponent's mirror is in the governor's residence, mine isn't. It was a bad political decision I made, but it was something I had to do in my life. And I think if you follow whatever your philosophy is, whatever your drive is, and I think part of the issue we've got now is when you say public service, it's different than power. The drive for power is different than a drive for public service. And we need people in public service.
You want to be a teacher, police officer, go work with city government. We need good people. My mic out.
I think so.
Here, is this one? Is this one that's?
Can I touch it? I just say, you know, whatever we need good people to be teachers, police officers, people to get in city government, people to step up into all sorts of roles, and people that are wound that way are there because they want to make a difference and they want to serve the public. I think running for office is a completely different thing, but it is also public service. You're running to make a difference. And I guess the shortest thing I can give you on running for office, if that's what you were more about asking in 2023, is remember that it's not about you. You know, we talk about politics and we talk about all these big things up here, but at the end of the day, it's about all the people in this room. And the first thing I tell people to do that are thinking about running for office is to go listen to people and to go talk to people. I mean, when I ran for office, I had all these ideas on things that I wanted to run on, but I had no idea if anybody else cared about those things. And the reality is it's kind of the meshing of those two. Go knock on doors, you know, if you're going to run, or, you know, slow down even from there and just go talk to people and listen and get an idea of, you know, where people really are and what the issues that exist are and decide if it's a good fit for you. But, you know, we need good people to run for office. But you don't have to run for office to make a difference in public service. That's what I'd say. And you don't have to be in public service to make a difference.
Yeah,
We need
that-
good people in the
question.
community.
It's a good question.
That's a great, I mean, whether you want to run or be in it, if it's what you feel is your calling, then do it. Like I said, I wouldn't, the 18 years I had at both county and the state system was fantastic. I learned so much. I met so many great people. In fact, I mean, people that are like family to me, because especially if you get on the campaign side of stuff too, I mean, you're in the trenches with some of these folks. And then when you're working on a real hot button issue, and maybe it's really, there's a lot of pressure because there's maybe a public spotlight on it. You're a team, and it's really rewarding. And we do need really good people. I was talking to a state senator on the way up here, and he's there all for the right reasons. There are some that go to be the, Paul O'Brien always would say the beers and the doers. You want to be someone or do something. This guy he's a doer, and it could be frustrating, but you have to be what Scott said. You could remember what your purpose is and be grounded and have a good life outside of Madison or wherever you're.
Be careful when you're
With it.
elected, how it changes you though, because
Yeah,
I was in
remember where you
I was
came
in elected office for
Yeah.
26 years. And, I said, and it's so darn long, I'm almost becoming a nice guy now. I got to get back to my normal self, back to the mean. But it does, I know it. I also say I've probably gotten more people to run for office because they think if McCallum could do it, anybody could do this. Must be easy.
But I think if
Running
you
for
run,
office is not easy.
it's not in these days. You have to have very, very, very thick skin.
Yeah.
Very.
Other questions? Still at 8 minutes.
One thing that you didn't speak about were unfunded mandates, and seeing those can really hamstring a agency, because a lot of the agency's budgets within the agency itself might have a large budget, but the number of programs and responsibilities that particular agency has to churn out has a lot of small budgets, small amounts of monies, maybe $100,000 here, $100,000 there, to do a lot of programming that is really dependent on people, in some instances, their own survival of programs. And so I guess looking at the budget process, just speaking about those unfunded mandates, especially when we're running such a large surplus, how that then falls into funding those things that may not have been able to be funded before.
Well, there's two ways to answer it. And I'll let my colleagues take the polite way on unfunded, and I'll be the bad guy on this. I've never heard of any mandate that was funded to what the organization wanted it to be. So it's a responsibility as well to let the funders, whether it be city council or any other agency, know what you can do and what you can't do within this. And then it becomes their option. But I don't know. Did you in finance ever hear of anybody who got as much money as?
I would say the other way
Go
is
on.
no one ever came to my office during the budget process and said, we need less money,
Yeah.
or we need no new money.
So I was the bad guy. The upside of this is it's a lot easier politically to say I'm taking care of this problem and then not fund it. So that,
But I mean, in terms of, so one of the things, and I think it's become a bigger issue, and I think it, the cities here and local governments have done a better job, I think, of highlighting the fact that when the state legislators are making decisions that are going to have, that are going to be unfunded mandates on local governments, highlighting the fact that those costs can't be absorbed. Unfortunately, all we get is a little sheet usually when we pass bills from the Department of Revenue that says may be able to absorb costs locally, which may not help. But I will say that the narrative out there on unfunded mandates has become louder, and it is real. But your, I think, initial point of the fact that too often those decisions are being made without consideration of those is noted.
And I had a kind of an epiphany when, so I worked in the speaker's office for 4 years and so saw the budget process through that way. And then I went on and did a couple other things. And then I ended up being the chief of staff to the Waukesha County executive for a while. And I saw not only our county together a budget, but then I saw how the state budget impacted the county. And I was like, what the heck did we pass that for? So I saw it from the other, I wish I had that. I said many times when I was at the county saying, boy, I wish I would have had this position before I went to the speaker's office because I would have understood better at the time, which is just a better way of saying the counties or whoever, the city, whatever group is getting that mandate just needs to be communicate even more to their legislator. And you see it in legislators that have that local experience, they get it. And then it's relying on them to communicate with others. But I had an awakening. I will say
Local
that.
government schools
I will
are
say that.
notorious for getting mandates of what they
Yeah.
ought to teach and how they ought to
Yeah.
teach.
Yeah.
Time for one more?
Does that answer it's good. We've been doing our job as politicians and I'm not really answering, but saying a lot of words without answering. So
I worked in public health for 26 years and public health just in general, $17 for every person in Wisconsin goes into public health. That's like the 30th in the nation for public health. But beside that, the programs that I oversaw, there were many that were unfunded mandates, and we got zero to put forth what was required under that legislation, or 100,000 to do something, and then a 5% cut came due to a over of the budgets, you know, every year, 5% or whatever it would be. Well, if you have $1 trillion budget, 5% is hardly anything. But if you have $100,000 budget, 5% starts eating at your programming, and pretty quick then it becomes not, you can't implement it. And so as soon as you can't implement, then the legislature comes in and says, oh, you're not implementing this to, you know, the fidelity of it, so let's just cut it out. And so then they cut the program, which was really a great program, but now you don't have the money to do it. And so it's cut. So then, yeah, so then it becomes zero. So you don't have to fund it anymore because it's no longer a mandate because it's been cut.
there is hope for you. The legislature has a wonderful tool called the Legislative Audit Bureau. The Audit Bureau takes different agencies and different programs and does an actual fiscal audit of what the responsibilities are. So if you have those, try to get the Audit Bureau to do an audit on it, and they will, they generally, I thought they do a pretty good job
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
non-politicians telling politicians if somebody's underfunded or not and how it ought to be reformed.
Well, last words to send out all of these bright-eyed students out into an enthusiastic future on budgeting.
Budget process matters. Sometimes it can seem dry, but the reality is all of these things matter to you and have an impact on your life, not just as students, but you know, universities, healthcare, local government, prisons, highways, all K-12 education, everything that goes on in your state is done through the state budget process. And one of the things I always like to say when I was trying to get people to care more was, you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. If you're not the one that's sitting there paying attention and following things, just be sure that someone else is. And if you don't trust that person, maybe it's time that you come to the table.
That's the first thing that popped in my mind as well, is get involved. And it's your responsibility in a democracy to do that. But if you don't, it's going to happen anyway. So learn the system, get involved, and participate in society.
And don't get discouraged if you don't get your way the first time or any time or whenever, you know, keep doing it. It matters. They do listen. And if you run a primer on the state budget, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau on their website has a nice document that walks you through the state budget process, and you can follow along on the way. But get involved, like, it matters. It really, it's your responsibility to get involved.
It's your money. It's your
Yeah,
future.
Your money, yeah.
So let's get a round of applause here. Thank you so much to all three of you. To everybody in the crowd, feel free to grab, ooh, something exciting is happening. Feel free to grab those pamphlets about the Masters of Public Administration program. If this stuff resonates with you, we also have pamphlets there about the Whitburn Center, and we'll continue to do these every month, either online or in person throughout the semester.